Story number 1. In my quiet suburban neighborhood, life was typically uneventful. That's why, when I decided to sell my old laptop on Craigslist, I expected nothing more than the usual exchange. A buyer, who introduced himself as Eric, responded to my ad quickly. He suggested we meet at a local park late in the evening, explaining he worked night shifts and this was his only free time. The arrangement was unusual, but I agreed, driven by the urgency to sell. The park was deserted when I arrived, with only the faint glow of streetlights punctuating the darkness. I waited near the playground, the creaking of the swings in the gentle breeze adding an eerie soundtrack to the night. Eric texted, saying he was running a few minutes late. As I waited, the solitude of the park began to feel oppressive, and a sense of unease crept over me. Finally, a figure approached. It was Eric, or so I presumed. He was taller and more imposing than I had imagined, his face obscured in the dim light. We exchanged greetings, and I presented the laptop. He inspected it, and then nodded in approval. But instead of proceeding with the payment, he looked around nervously and suggested we finalize the transaction in his car for privacy. Reluctantly, I followed him to a car parked in a shadowy corner of the lot. Something felt off, but the prospect of completing the sale and leaving the place pushed me forward. As soon as we sat in the car, Eric's demeanor shifted. He suddenly claimed that he had forgotten his wallet and needed to fetch it from his apartment nearby. He insisted I wait in the car with the laptop, offering his car keys as a sign of good faith. The moment he left, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. The situation felt increasingly dangerous, and I decided to leave. Just as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something in the back seat. A pile of personal belongings, including what looked like women's purses and a couple of phones. My heart raced as the implication hit me. These items didn't belong to Eric. They were likely trophies from other unsuspecting sellers. I hurried back to my car, my thoughts racing. Before I could drive away, Eric returned, his expression now menacing. He realized I had seen the items in his car and now blocked my exit. My mind screamed danger. In a desperate bid for safety, I threw the laptop at him, using the moment of surprise to slip past him and get into my car. I sped away, my hands trembling on the wheel, the chilling image of Eric's furious face etched in my memory. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of a well-lit gas station, where I called the police. The investigation that followed was a blur. The police discovered that Eric was a suspect in a series of Craigslist robberies. The items in his car were indeed stolen from people he had lured under the guise of buying their goods. The aftermath left me shaken. My once peaceful suburb now felt tainted, a reminder of the night I came face to face with a predator. I couldn't help but think of what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts and escaped when I did. I learned a hard lesson about the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly innocuous interactions. The laptop, once just an object I wanted to sell, had become a symbol of my brush with true terror. I vowed never to engage in such transactions again, the price of safety far outweighing any potential sale. From then on, the quiet of the suburbs no longer meant peace to me, but a reminder of the night I nearly fell victim to a Craigslist horror story. The experience lingered, a haunting memory in the stillness of the night. Story number 2. In an effort to declutter my life and home, I stumbled upon a seemingly forgotten vintage camera nestled in the back of my closet. Its retro charm and the memories it held seemed too precious to simply discard, so I turned to Craigslist, hoping it would find a new owner who appreciated its value. What I didn't realize was that this decision would unravel into a sequence of events that would terrify me to my core. The ad was simple. Vintage camera for sale, perfect for collectors. Within hours, I received a response from a buyer named Mr. Collins, who expressed an eager interest in purchasing it immediately. His emails were polite, yet there was an underlying urgency in his tone that I found slightly off-putting. Nevertheless, we agreed on a price, and he insisted on picking it up from my house that very night. In retrospect, agreeing to his late-night visit was my first mistake. Mr. Collins arrived at my doorstep well past the agreed time, close to midnight, apologizing profusely for his tardiness. He was an unassuming man, middle-aged, with a polite demeanor that put me at ease momentarily. However, as he examined the camera, his behavior shifted. His eyes lit up with an intensity that felt disproportionate to the situation, and he began asking personal questions about where I found the camera, how long I'd had it, and if I'd used it recently. Unnerved by his sudden change in demeanor, I hurried the transaction along, eager to get him out of my house. Once the camera was safely in his hands, and the money was in mine, I bid him goodnight and locked the door behind him. I tried to scratch off the uneasy feeling his visit had left me with, chalking it up to the late hour and my overactive imagination. That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly on my nightstand. Groggily, I picked it up to find multiple missed calls and a string of messages from an unknown number, all sent in a short span of time while I had managed to fall asleep. The messages were photos, each one more disturbing than the last, taken from outside my windows, showcasing different angles of my house in the dead of night. The last message was a chilling text. "The camera sees more than you know." Panic set in as I realized someone was outside watching me. I called the police, reporting a stalker outside my home, and waited in fear, every shadow and sound from outside seeming like a threat. The police arrived quickly but found no one. They suggested the photos could be a twisted prank, perhaps even related to the sale of the vintage camera, but they had little to go on. In the following days, I was plagued by paranoia. I received no further messages, but the fear that Mr. Collins, or whoever had taken those photos, might return lingered. I began to doubt the safety of my own home, jumping at every noise and shadow. The vintage camera, once a cherished item, had brought a terror into my life that I couldn't shake. The culmination of my fear occurred 1 week later. I came home from work to find a package on my doorstep, no return address, no markings. Inside was the vintage camera, the same one I had sold to Mr. Collins, accompanied by a note. "It sees everything. You can't escape." The implication was clear and horrifying. Had Mr. Collins returned the camera because he had gotten what he had wanted from it? Or was it from someone else sending me a message? The police were baffled, unable to trace the package or the eerie communications back to anyone. I moved out shortly thereafter, unable to bear the constant fear that living in that house brought me. The camera was left behind, a symbol of the unseen terror that had invaded my life. The ordeal left me with a deep-seated unease about the anonymity and dangers of online transactions, a reminder that we can never truly know the intentions of those we engage with in the digital world. This experience taught me the hard lesson that some items carry with them shadows that are best left undisturbed. The vintage camera, intended as a simple sale, became the lens through which a nightmare unfolded, one that I hope never to relive. Story number 3. In my small, quiet town, where life usually revolved around community events and local gossip, I turned to Craigslist to find a buyer for my grandfather's old pocket watch. It was an exquisite piece, but sentiment couldn't pay the bills. The buyer, a man named Mr. Jordan, responded to my ad with keen interest. His messages were courteous, but always ended with an insistence on meeting at his place, a secluded old house on the outskirts of town. Despite my reservations, my need for the sale won over. The day of the exchange was overcast. with a chill wind that seemed to whisper through the trees. Mr. Jordan's house was at the end of a narrow, winding road surrounded by a dense thicket of woods that cast long, dark shadows even in the daylight. The house itself was a relic of the past, its once grand facade now weathered and worn. I hesitated at the gate, the eerie quiet of the place setting my nerves on edge. As I approached the door, it creaked open before I could knock, revealing Mr. Jordan. He was an elderly man, his back hunched, his eyes sunken yet sharp. He motioned for me to follow him inside, his movements slow but deliberate. The interior of the house was like stepping back in time, filled with antiques and the musty scent of age. Mr. Jordan led me to a dimly lit room where he examined the pocket watch with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it, and for a moment I thought I saw a glint of something other than reflection in his eyes. As he handed over the cash, he insisted I see a collection of his own in the basement. Politely declining felt impossible under his persistent gaze. The descent into the basement was like walking into darkness itself. The air grew colder, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the bottom of the stairs. The basement was a cavern of relics, but what caught my attention was a series of old photographs on the wall. They were pictures of people, their faces marked out, and among them, to my growing terror, were a few recent photos of myself, unmistakably taken without my knowledge. Fear constricted my throat, and as I turned to confront Mr. Jordan, I found him blocking my path, his expression no longer benign. His voice was a raspy whisper as he spoke of his fascination with time and how some people were timeless. His words were cryptic, but the threat behind them was clear. I realized then that this was no mere sale. It was a trap, and I was the unwitting prey. In a moment of panic-fueled courage, I pushed past him, my only thought to escape the suffocating terror of that house. I raced up the stairs, stumbling in my haste, hearing Mr. Jordan's footsteps eerily calm behind me. Bursting out of the house, I didn't stop to look back until I was safely in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from that haunted place. In the rearview mirror, the house stood silent, a sentinel to the madness I had just escaped. The aftermath was a blur of police events and sleepless nights. Mr. Jordan was never found, and the house, upon later investigation, was empty, as if he had vanished into thin air. The photos in the basement were gone, leaving no evidence of the terror I had experienced. The encounter left a scar on my psyche, a haunting reminder of the unseen dangers lurking behind seemingly innocent interactions. I never sold anything on Craigslist again, the memory of Mr. Jordan and his terrifying house forever etched in my mind. The experience taught me that some things carry a price higher than their worth in money, a lesson in fear that I carried to this day. The old pocket watch, once a cherished heirloom, became a symbol of my narrow escape from a nightmare that felt all too real. Story number 4. In the solitude of my apartment, nestled in a bustling city where anonymity was a given, I ventured onto Craigslist to sell an old laptop. It was an innocent enough act, spurred by the need for extra cash and the desire to declutter. Little did I know, this simple act would spiral into a nightmarish encounter that would leave me questioning the safety of my own home. The buyer, who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson in our email exchanges, was polite and enthusiastic. He agreed to my asking price without bargaining and requested to pick up the laptop late in the evening, citing work commitments. Something about the timing unsettled me, but the urgency to sell overpowered my initial hesitance. Mr. Thompson arrived punctually at 9 p.m., his figure shrouded in the dim light of the apartment complex's poorly lit hallway. He was of average height, nondescript, wearing a coat that seemed too heavy for the season. His face was partly obscured by a hat, casting a shadow that hid his eyes. We exchanged brief pleasantries, and I handed him the laptop. He inspected it, handed me the cash, and left with a hurried thanks. Relieved, I thought that was the end of it. But as the night progressed, a sense of unease began to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I peered through the peephole of my door periodically, half expecting to see someone there, but the hallway remained empty. The first sign that something was amiss came when I received an email from Mr. Thompson just past midnight. It was blank except for a photo attachment. The image was a grainy, black and white photo of my own apartment door. Panic surged through me. How did he take this without me noticing? I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, trying to convince myself that it was a misguided attempt at humor. But as the night wore on, more emails arrived, each containing photos taken from inside my apartment. One showed the couch I was sitting on, another the hallway leading to my bedroom, and the most chilling of all, a photo of me looking at my laptop screen. The realization that someone was inside with me, taking photos in real time, sent me into a state of terror I had never experienced before. I called the police, whispering my situation, afraid that any sound might alert my unseen intruder to my awareness of their presence. The operator's calm voice instructed me to lock myself in a room and wait for the police to arrive. I chose the bathroom, the only room with a lock, and I waited in the dark, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Every noise was amplified, every creak a potential harbinger of doom. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours until I heard the reassuring sound of the police knocking on my door. The search yielded nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the closets or under the bed. The officers suggested it might have been a prank, albeit a sick one, and advised me to stay with friends for the night. But the photos were real, and the fear they instilled in me was palpable. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The following day, I moved out, leaving behind the city and its cloak of anonymity for a sense of safety that had been irrevocably shattered. The incident left me with a deep-seated mistrust of strangers and the digital marketplace that had brought Mr. Thompson into my life. Months have passed, but the emails haven't stopped. They arrive sporadically, each one a silent reminder that my life had intersected with someone who derived pleasure from instilling fear. The police have yet to find him, and I've yet to find peace. This experience has taught me the dark side of connectivity, how our lives can be invaded by those we unwittingly invite in. I sold a laptop on Craigslist, but the price I paid was far greater than any sum of money. Story number 5. As a regular in the world of Craigslist, I had found it an invaluable resource for unearthing local treasures. But one listing, an offer for a seemingly perfect vintage bicycle, turned my typical Craigslist adventure into a nightmarish ordeal. This encounter would forever change my view of these faceless transactions. The seller, who called himself Mark, communicated in brief, terse messages. He suggested we meet at an old, run-down playground at the edge of town. The area, known for its once vibrant community, had seen better days. Buildings were boarded up, and the streets were often deserted after dark. My initial reluctance was overshadowed by the allure of the bicycle. As I reached the playground, twilight had given way to a deep blue dusk. The swings creaked mournfully into the wind, and the merry-go-round stood still, a relic of happier times. Mark was nowhere in sight. I sent him a text and he promptly replied, asking me to meet him behind the community center adjacent to the playground. His reasoning was the bike was too big to carry over. It seemed logical, yet an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. The back of the community center was poorly lit, with only a few flickering streetlights in the distance. I hesitated at the corner of the building, peering into the dimly lit area. As I stepped forward, a sudden movement in the shadows caught my eye. Before I could react, I was confronted by two figures emerging from the darkness. Mark was nowhere to be seen. These were not friendly faces. their intentions became immediately clear. This was no sale, it was a trap. The chilling realization hit me. I had walked into a setup, and the threat of danger was real and immediate. One of the men demanded my wallet, phone, and other valuables. His voice was cold, his demeanor menacing. The other, silent and brooding, hovered in the background, a sinister presence. My mind raced with fear and adrenaline. I contemplated screaming for help, but the desolate surroundings offered little hope of a savior. As I slowly reached into my pocket, pretending to retrieve my wallet, my survival instincts kicked in. In a sudden movement, I turned and ran, sprinting back towards the street. I could hear their footsteps pounding the ground behind me, a terrifying symphony that fueled my desperate flight. I reached the main street, the bright lights of passing cars, a beacon of safety. Glancing back, I saw the two figures had stopped, hesitating at the edge of the light, before disappearing back into the shadows. Out of breath and shaking, I realized how narrowly I had escaped. Once home, the gravity of the situation sank in. I had been lured into a potentially dangerous situation, blinded by the prospect of a rare find. I reported the incident to the police, but with only vague descriptions and no tangible evidence, there was little hope of finding the perpetrators. The experience left me deeply shaken. The sense of anonymity and trust I had associated with online marketplaces was shattered. The playground, once a symbol of communal joy, had transformed in my mind into a place of dread and deception. I learned a harsh lesson about the risks of meeting strangers from the internet, especially in secluded, unpopulated areas. The vintage bicycle, which I had so eagerly sought, now represented a naive disregard for my own safety. It was a chilling reminder that behind the facade of a good deal could lurk a sinister trap. From then on, I vowed to conduct such transactions only in public, well-frequented places and never alone. The lure of a Craigslist bargain would never again blind me to the potential dangers hidden in the shadows of seemingly harmless encounters.